Right, okay. So this is going to be a very short video, just overviewing the concept of the 12 markers at GCSE in focus of the Elizabeth Paper 2 prep. Now, the purpose of this video is to go through some really tricky questions, but also give you some last-minute advice on what a 12 marker is actually looking like from someone who has marked this for many years. It's really important to understand the success criteria. So just a reminder, the simplified checklist for paper 2 Elizabeth. Now remember, this is part 1 of paper 2 that you will spend roughly 55 minutes on in the exam. It's very, very important that you understand that you also have American West, which you will spend 50 to 55 minutes on also. I'm hoping that by the end of this video, I will cover quite a lot that's on this page, just so you can give yourself that preparation for next week's exam. Now, the concept of an explain question, I'm going to really simplify it. For someone that marks and has marked regularly, it's important that you understand that what way we teach you it, even if you do just 50% of that, you should access 10 plus marks. So first of all, we must always make sure that we know the focus of the question. What does the question want you to do? Does it want to talk? Does it want you to talk about the cause of something? Does it want you to talk about the impact of something? Does it want you to talk about the significance of something? So concept of the question's paramount. You then must remember that we need 3 reasons to answer the question. Now, if that is just a P paragraph, that will be okay, as long as the evidence is strong and the explain puts focus on the question. The one thing the mark scheme says is the evidence should be wide-ranging, hence why we tell you to do 3 lots of evidence, then explain it, because then you will hit the criteria to get 10 out of 12 and above. The most important thing is to make the answer clear for the examiner. There's nothing worse than to try to pick out what you're trying to say. Tell me the story, tell me how it links to the question, and then move on to paragraph 2. Keep it as simple as that. In the next video I will talk about how that correlates to 16 markers, which actually isn't much different. So I'm going to do some quick power planning, understanding these questions. Now, these questions would be tricky. However, it's really important that we look at all difficult questions. So if an easy one comes up, then next week will be much easier. So explain why the plots were a threat to Elizabeth. Now, obviously, we know this is a 12 marker because of the word explain. We need to know when, in terms of a threat, it could mean a threat to her life or a plan to threaten her life. So we're going to consider a few of the plots. So first of all, you need to remember the first plot, which is the Northern Earls. Now, the plan of the Northern Earls was to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Duke of Norfolk. Now, the Duke of Norfolk was a very powerful individual. He was one of the most senior nobles in England. Now, this was all found out about, and the Duke of Norfolk was put in prison. First of all, this would be a threat, because marrying Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Duke of Norfolk would have made them very powerful and probably boosted Mary's claim to be the monarch of England. Now, once the Duke of Norfolk was put in prison, the plan carried on. And what happened was the Earl of Westmoreland and Northumberland, they carried on and they took over Durham Cathedral. Remember, they are in the north. The north had a lot of Catholic support at this time. So Westmoreland and Northumberland took over Durham Cathedral and they started to perform mass. Now, this ended up getting support from about 5,000 rebels. So it was very risky because Elizabeth was in the south. So this had potential to do a lot of damage. Elizabeth, she had to respond quickly, which shows it was a risk. She sent 14,000 troops to put down this uprising. And following this, Elizabeth became harsher. She had 450 Catholics executed, which shows the threat of this plot. So that's the Northern Earls. The second one, I'm going a bit out of chronology here, is the Babington plot, which we should know is the last plot to happen in 1586. Now, this was very dangerous because the plan was to execute Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, the plotters communicated through letters, and it was found out by Walsingham. Remember, it's about knowing the story and showing that off to the examiners. Now, the other aspect here was that there was a lot of support from Spain, France, and the Pope, with up to 60,000 troops being promised for this plot. Now, the biggest reason why this was a threat is because it showed a clear and immediate threat to life, which led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. So if you were just to write about these two in the exam, you would achieve 8 out of 12. If you were to give the story and give the reason why it was a threat, you would achieve that. However, that wouldn't be enough to achieve the 12. So, just going to remove these off here, and we're going to go back and we're going to look at the third reason why plots were a threat to Elizabeth. And the reason we're going to look at here is we're going to look at the Ridolfi plot in 1571. Now, this wasn't the most threatening, but the plan was a concern. So we need to consider here that Ridolfi, he was a spy for the Pope. And what we saw here were messages between Mary and Philip. Now, the plan, once again, was to kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. And once again, to marry the Duke of Norfolk, which I'm sure you remember I said was a very high-powered senior noble. Now, this shows that the plan and the support for Catholic plots was growing, which gives it a threat, because don't forget, Catholics were all over Europe. They were in the north of England. So all they needed to get was a little bit of momentum for it to be a real threat. There were also plans for Spain to give 10,000 troops, but those troops never materialized. Now, the key thing about this is that even though it was uncovered early, it shows the depth of Catholic threat. It shows that the removal of Elizabeth was not going to disappear. It wasn't going away. So plots were a continued threat throughout Elizabeth's reign, until, of course, the Babington plot, which we mentioned previously. The second question I'd like to go through is why Mary, Queen of Scots, had a stronger claim to the throne than Elizabeth. Now, I'm not going to go through this in huge depth. For some of these questions, I'm just going to give what your points would be. So, reason one for this one is that Mary may have been considered more legitimate than Elizabeth. So, for this, you need to really consider the fact that Mary, Queen of Scots, actually had Tudor blood. And the way she had this Tudor blood was because she was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. So even though she's not a direct blood lineage, she did have Tudor blood through great lineage, as discussed. And then you could also talk about the fact that Elizabeth's legitimacy goes back to the fact that she was a bastard child due to questions around Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's relationship when she was conceived. The second reason why Mary, Queen of Scots, had a stronger claim is just all down to this, all down to religion. This is a very easy argument here, but you can argue that Mary had lots of support from the key countries, your Spains, your Frances, your Scotlands. All of those would have significantly supported Mary, and not forgetting that Elizabeth was a Protestant. And the third reason may well be experience. Now, Elizabeth, you could link back to Elizabeth not having a husband and the fact she was very reluctant to marry and have children. Whereas on the flip side, Mary, Queen of Scots, had a son called James that instantly makes her claim stronger. Also, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been raised as a future queen from a baby. So instantly people had more support for her because they knew she was willing to have a husband which would protect the country. And as a result, she would have children, which would provide more stability for England. You could argue that Mary had a much stronger claim by thinking that Elizabeth had quite a weak claim in the eyes of certain people. Okay, now, the next few questions are very niche that would provide a bit of a challenge if you were to get these in the exam, especially this one on poverty, but I'll come back to that shortly. This question, I wouldn't be surprised if you got a features question, but if the exam board were feeling a little bit strict, they might ask you why the church was important to Elizabethan society or to Elizabeth. Now, there's a few things that we could mention here. Firstly, the importance of everyday life for people. We need to remember that in the eyes of people during this period, heaven was the goal. So the church was important in regards to ensuring that people were guided on the right path. And that included key events in life like baptisms, weddings, funerals. This was to make them vitally important, as it would guide people to heaven. It would guide people on the correct way to live. You could mention there just about the role of the church and what they did day in, day out for the people of England. For Elizabeth, they were vital because they helped enforce the religious settlement. If you've got a features question on this, this has to be your feature. They helped enforce Elizabeth's rules for the church, including supremacy and uniformity. The church's role was to ensure ultimately that people were loyal to Elizabeth as the head of the church. This in turn makes Elizabeth stronger. So the church was really important to Elizabeth's overall strength because they help enforce her rules of religion. Third one that could be quite tricky is you could say the church provided aspects of education and charity. And what we mean here is that they do look after the poor. However, it was very limited because of the closure of the monasteries. So they did look after the poor, which was quite an important role in their life. They'd also help provide for the sick, especially those people who were seen as your deserving poor. So people who did need support, people who were unable to work. So that was really important that we understand that. You could also ensure that you talk about education of the local community. Education was very limited. So religious schools, Sunday schools would have been very, very important. This would be a very, very tricky question. However, this would be enough to get you the top marks if you remember it. Right, poverty has not come up for a while, especially why there was poverty. So we've got to really understand the impacts of this. So the number one most important reason is population. England grew to 4 million people in 50 years. And that was an increase of from 3.2 million. It grew massively, especially in the towns, because a lot of people from the villages were beginning to move to towns because of loss of work, loss of jobs in farming. Now, population increase puts a lot of pressure on infrastructure. And ultimately, it was just too quick to cope with. So as a result of this, there were a range of consequences. Consequences such as wages decreased. Because ultimately, lots of people were looking for work, and employers took advantage. They offered lower wages because they knew that the people that were desperate would accept the wages. Food prices also increased because of the demand for food. And because harvest was poor, harvest was bad, it meant food prices had to go up, which meant people could not afford their food, which meant as a result led to extreme poverty. Rent also increased, which meant lots of people became vagabonds because they couldn't afford their rent and became homeless with no job. They aimlessly walked the streets as a result of the massive population change in England, especially London. Now, a lot of people say that this change happened because of enclosure and sheep farming. So, I'd write about these together. Basically, with enclosure, people used to have public land. But what people started to do was to close off these lands with fences. This meant there was less room for farming on public land, which meant poorer people could not grow food, which as a result led to them becoming poorer because they didn't have the basic standard of living. Sheep were also really important because of their wool. Wool was the most traded item in England. And what happened was farmers started to focus more on sheep than crops, which meant that farmers lost their jobs. And as a result, poverty it continued. They would have ended up moving to the towns, which then was massively pressurized because of population. You could write about both of those separate in an exam. A third thing you could talk about is the loss of charity because of the closure of the monasteries by Henry VIII. Poverty increased for a range of different reasons. And again, you've got everything you need there to be successful if this were to come up as a 12 marker next week. Now, some of these I won't go through massively because they came up last year as well. So exploration hasn't really come up over the last few years. It's something that's really important, but actually quite an easy question to answer if it did come up. So basically, why did people travel to America? And we know this place to be called the New World, but in the exam, you must refer to it as America. And there's three very clear reasons: new technology in ships. We've got improvement in maps and navigation. And we've also got Drake, who encouraged people to copy him because of his success. That's about as far as I'll go with that one. But before the exam, I'm more than happy to answer questions on that one. It's, again, important that we know it, but I think that's an area that we would remember quite substantially based on what we've done previously. Now, why Mary was executed all does very much come back to claim and plots that we've spoke about previously. So your paragraphs that you'd write about here is you talk about the Babington plot again. You talk about why that plot directly linked to execution. You talk about Mary's claim to the throne and why, again, that was a threat which led to the execution. And you could also talk about pressure from Parliament, which was also very important, as they were very much putting pressure on Elizabeth after the plots to take significant action to remove Mary, Queen of Scots, to make it look like she was a strong monarch. Parliament were thinking about national security and to ensure that Elizabeth looked strong and not vulnerable to places like Spain. Now, we've got a handful more. So 6 more to go through. Again, I'm not going to go through them all in masses of depth. Some of them I will more than others. Now, this next question about the theatre is a very interesting one. I personally think you would be asked a features question, but you might be asked why theatre became popular. So there's a few things to consider here. Number one, everyone could do it. Everyone could go. Rich and poor who were not held back by money. Remember, 1p could get you a seat in the pit. This showed that the theatre was inclusive and people especially enjoyed the more comical plays, not secular, so religious, that was on. That's an easy paragraph. Theatre became popular because everyone could go. Everyone could do it. And ultimately, there was no restrictions, which meant more people went to the theatre. That's really important. And you could also, I guess, to an extent, talk about how wealth helped the growth of the theatre. So don't forget, England was becoming richer, and the richer it became, the more theatres that would be built. Second thing you could talk about is the growth in population. Now, even though population had a negative impact, you could argue that it did help the theatre become more popular because of places like London growing so much. Because London was growing, it led to new theatres like the Globe and the Rose, which meant they were now more easily accessible to go to the theatre. And on top of that, because of the variety of plays, it made it very, very popular with all individuals to go. The theatre also became very popular because of Elizabeth. Elizabeth very much raised the status of the theatre by providing money for troops, and troops were groups of travelling actors that would attend the theatre and put on shows, and groups such as the Queen's Men. Now, even though Elizabeth didn't actually go to the theatre, it shows that by providing patronage for these groups, that it had royal approval, which gave the theatre lots of respect, which meant lots of people went to it. So the theatre became popular for many, many reasons. That's your real snapshot on why it became popular. Walsingham, why it was important, this would be an absolute dream question. So I'm not going to go through this in depth, but you could talk about his role in the plots. You could talk about his spy network that he created in England, which supported Elizabeth. And you could also talk about his spy network in Europe as well. He was basically vital, but you need to just have 3 clear reasons. So make sure you go back through and understand about decoding. Make sure that you understand that in Europe, he had double agents. Lots of clear reasons why Walsingham was vital. Right, the last few, then that's the first part to this video before, and then I will show you, I'll go back to the first slide just to show you how much that covers. Now, this would be a really, I want to say, revolting question without no pun intended. But why did the Northern Earls revolt? Why did they go against Elizabeth? So, keeping it really simple here. First one's got to be religion. Remember, they were Catholic. They would have been influenced by the Pope. They would have hated the religious settlement. They wanted to replace with Mary, Queen of Scots. So again, it's a really repetitive paragraph, but Elizabeth basically threatened their faith. Elizabeth wanted to take control. She set up the Council of Blood, which wanted more control in the north. So they were very worried about them losing their influence. 2 was because of power and their loss of influence. Elizabeth replaced a lot of them with key Protestant people, such as the Archbishop of Durham, who became a Protestant. They wanted to regain their northern power. The third thing you could talk about is money, the economy, and really link that argument into their wives, who wanted to push them into gaining back their land, their patronage, to make sure that they also had that influence through wealth. So short plan, but really effective if you were to able to identify that in next week's exam. Right. I think this could be a very, very nice question as well. Why Drake's circumnavigation was significant. Remember, significant means important. Important means impact. So I'm not going to go through this one in depth. You just need 3 reasons. Firstly, England's reputation was boosted. Remember, the circumnavigation gained lots of wealth, but it was the first time that an Englishman had done this. It also encouraged further exploration. It's really important to England's economic wealth. In the short term, brought back huge wealth to England. Again, really important because of the raiding of Spanish settlements. In excess of around 400,000 we're talking about. Now, Elizabeth would have received a share of this, which would be important to the country's strength, but it would have also had a long-term impact on the navy, which in turn would have eventually helped with war against Spain in 1588. The third reason, though, now this is a negative impact, but it made relations with Spain worse. Remember, significant doesn't need to be good. It could also be bad. King Philip hated Drake. Okay? Remember, the one phrase to use for Drake is the ultimate antagonist. So, the circumnavigation were vital. That travel around the world were really, really important. The last 2 of this part of the video is why Elizabeth created the religious settlement and why England and Spain went to war. Now, We know the impact of the religious settlement, but why did she create it? Why did she want these rules? Again, short plan this one's going to be. Firstly, to unite a religiously divided country. Secondly, secure her position as the queen. The act of supremacy made her the supreme leader of the church. And it was another way also to control the church, to try and remove Catholic influence without upsetting people too much. We will go through that before the exam in our boosters, but it's a very manageable question to understand why did she put religious rules in place. The last one that really comes to mind as a question that I think could come up is war. Why did England and Spain go to war? There are 4 clear factors for war that you need to remember. Religion, trade, Drake, and the Netherlands. I would say religion is number 1, is the ongoing reason. I would say Netherlands was the spark because of Elizabeth's direct involvement. I would say trade and Drake were both annoyances, but not enough to cause a war. They were more annoying. Religion and the Netherlands were by far 2 of the most important reasons why war happened. The only one I'm going to go through in a bit of depth is the Netherlands. The rest are all manageable, I think, to talk about. But remember, the Netherlands were Protestant and they were controlled by Spain, and Spain were Catholic. Spain treated Netherlands harshly, and they used torture to try and get people to become Catholic. So events such as the Spanish Inquisition used methods of torture to try and get people to be Catholic. This meant that some Protestants fled to England, and these were called sea beggars. Now, this upset Philip because it looked like Elizabeth was protecting them. She didn't get rid of them. She did allow them to stay in England. We would call this indirect support because she's not actually going over to the Netherlands. We could also say that obviously by 1585, Netherlands and England, they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Nonsuch, which looked like a declaration of war. It's very important that by then Elizabeth started to send people like Dudley to the Netherlands with troops, and it very much looked like at this point England was supporting Netherlands from an aspect where they wanted war to happen. But it looked like by supporting the Netherlands, that was the spark for Philip to declare war on England. Drake, if I had to rank them in order, religion's up there, number 1 reason. Think about the religious settlement. Think about Catholicism. Think about Pope excommunicating Elizabeth. The Netherlands was ongoing and seemed like a bit of a spark. Drake, probably number 3 in terms of the constant pirating and the singeing of the king's beard. Trade, that constant annoyance that English privateers were going into Spanish land without a license and stealing from Spanish-owned American land. Right, so just to finish the video, remember, as I've said, number 1, 3 clear reasons. Evidence, evidence, evidence. Explain. Answer the question. You don't need to do much to get 12. I promise you. Someone who's marking, has marked in previously, it's very easy to get 12 as long as you stick to the structure. 3, don't make an assumption on the story. Show what you know. And fourthly, if you're panicking, describe the bullet points. That can still get you 7 out of 12. And I think that's really important you understand that, because that is absolutely vital to you achieving those marks to get you to the next stage. Now, just going back to the first page, covered theatre, covered the religious settlement, covered the role of the church, covered Mary, Queen of Scots, looked at the plots, we've looked at Walsingham, looked at why Mary was executed, we've touched upon why there was war with Spain, poverty is in this video, reason for exploration increasing, and why Drake's circumnavigation was significant. This video has done at least 3/4 of what you need. So keep going, keep focusing, and the next video I do will be based around 16 marker exams.